to allow them to present, as well as have this conversation, this World Cafe that we're planning to do today. But before we hand it over to the speakers, I'll just give a little bit of background on like the context of what we're trying to do here. So our session is really about trying to figure out how we can better integrate local voices, community values into the planning stage of projects, in light of the fact that like there's a lot of global commitments going on right now about expanding protected areas, conservation areas, development pressure for green transitions, etc. So a lot of this planning often happens at different scales, and we're trying to foster a conversation that includes people that work at these different scales, what their methodologies are, and ideally how we reconcile or integrate interdisciplinary or cross-scale methodologies. And thankfully and gratefully, we have two talks today that sort of touch on these issues. We're really excited to start with Luisa Escobar Alvarado, who's going to be talking about her work in Angola as part of her PhD work, correct? And so I'll hand it over to her to go from there.
Hi, thank you. So yeah, my name is Luisa, and yeah, I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. I should have the logo there, sorry. And yeah, I really thought about like if I should do this in Spanish or English. I'm a Spanish speaker, and I often want to say, like when I introduce myself, I say that I'm a Mexican, and I think because I am a very proud Mexican, but also because often where we come from has to do with how we view the world. And I'm incredibly happy to be back in my country to share my work, even though it's not in Mexico, but it's very nice to be back in Oaxaca and to hear Spanish and to see Mexicans doing interesting things in the world. So yeah, my talk it's a bit scientific, but it's more about my experience working as a Mexican in Angola. So it's a bit more of how it's been working in Angola. So overall, I'm going to be talking about what's the possible value of participatory methods in mapping landscapes, and how this could be important and could have an implication in conservation initiatives. Sorry, thanks. So overall, just to give you a bit of a context, when I started my PhD, I am a biologist and I do now ecology. So the idea was to understand the vegetation in Angola. So that was my initial plan. So I started looking at maps of Africa, and for those of you who are familiar with African vegetations or biomes or ecoregions, they seem quite like, so you go to the equator and it's the moist forest, and then below and above it's what most people term savannas. So they don't look, Africa doesn't look wildly diverse from these maps. So when I was looking at maps of Africa, I started focusing on Angola, on the southern region of Africa, and I was seeing that mostly we had savannas. So it looked quite a homogeneous landscape. As I said, sorry, I wanted the picture. So I work in Angola, and when I was looking at the literature, a lot of you are PhD students, and before we go for the first time to our field of study, we read all this literature and we build an idea of what we're going to see when we go to the field. So my idea of Angola was built upon quite a uniform, homogeneous vegetation. And Angola has been termed a miombo woodland predominantly. For those of you who are not familiar with what a miombo is a type of vegetation that is dominated by 3 species mainly, Brachystegia, Julbernaria, and Isoberlinia. And miombo, it's because in Swahili, the local name for Brachystegia, it's muombo. So it's been termed miombo. So Angola, it's mostly, or people, or scientists have classified Angola as mostly miombo. And a miombo vegetation, it's a savanna type of vegetation. It's a vegetation that burns, that it's dystrophic. It has low levels of nutrients in the soil, and it's the most extensive type of vegetation in Africa, not only in Angola. So yeah, so it's been termed a wet miombo woodland. So I am a part of a project that is trying to do conservation in Southeast Angola. For those of you who are familiar with the Okavango Delta, the Okavango Delta, it's a delta that is important for wildlife and diversity of southern Africa. It's a delta that receives seasonally floods and a lot of diversity migrate. So it's internationally protected and recognized. But a few years ago, some people from the Walbert Trust were trying to understand the whole system of the Okavango, and they arrived into southeastern Angola, and they realized that there was this very pristine, or that's what they defined pristine forest that were protecting the Okavango Delta. So they decided to create the Okavango Wilderness Project, who's trying to protect the whole system of the Delta. So my region of study develops in southeastern Angola, where these watersheds of the Okavango Delta, or where these rivers originate. And this has been mostly classified as a homogeneous miombo woodland. And it has also been termed as the largest contiguous miombo of Africa, and the most pristine, and the most like the miombo that has the least levels of disturbance in the continent. Also, this region is interesting. It's important because for those of you who are familiar with Angolan history, Angola underwent a 27-year civil war, followed by a 14 years war of independence. So this area, the southeast, was the stronghold of the UNITA, of the guerrilla wars. And somehow, up until now, this area has remained marginalized and isolated, and possibly because its political affiliations in the past. So this region has somehow kept undisturbed because it's really difficult to access, it's really remote, but also the communities have remained marginalized. And these are the kind of things that you find when you're driving into the landscape, just war tanks, and it's also one of the most heavily mined land with the most amount of landmines in the country. So this is when it starts, like my experience. So I'm going to the field for the first time. It's really difficult to access. So it usually takes about 5 days driving, if you get lucky, from the capital, or it can even be up to 7, or it depends if it's rainy season. So the first time we went there, we flew. We took a small plane, and I'm expecting this homogeneous miombo, and as I'm flying. I'm seeing all these different things, and I'm like, this does not look like a homogeneous landscape. And obviously, I arrived into the ground, and I started walking around the landscape, and it just did not look like a homogeneous vegetation. Some places were quite open, lots of trees. Some places had the open ones had few trees, then there's some other places with lots of trees. Some places had no trees. So I started thinking, well, this is quite diverse. And most importantly, these places were used by people, were important by people. So this pristine landscape that I was told that I was going to find, it was not a pristine landscape. It was a landscape that looks like it's imbalanced, that looks like the use it's a healthy use where the system can still provide the services that local communities need, but the place was used. And these differences, these different vegetation types were very important for local communities, and local communities use these different places for different purposes and reasons. So I started thinking, as a PhD student who is a student in a high-income country but has funding from a middle-income country, I was very limited in funding, and I think that's something that also hasn't been talked about here, how difficult it is to access funding sometimes for PhD students. So I said, well, what can I do to understand this place when I'm limited in time and I'm limited in resources? So what better than to talk to people? And that's when my project shifted from me being interested in this homogeneous miombo into being interested in populated forests. And when I say populated, it's by people. It shifted to my main focus of study. So I started asking people. I realized that people could tell me more across time and across space. People who have always lived in these places could tell me what happened now, but 20 years ago too. And they could also tell me what happened not only around the villages, but also further from the villages, because these people developed activities many kilometers around the villages. So I undertook participatory methods. For those of you who are not familiar with what participatory mapping, which was my main method, it's a method where you allow local communities to represent themselves spatially. So you allow them to tell you what's around there, how do they perceive space, and it's a method that serves to empower local communities to give them voice and visibility. So I started talking to people, And these are just some pictures of the map. What was really cool, I thought, it was people always started mapping the water bodies. And that was like the spine of the body of their landscape. The water body was at the center, and then they could start telling you things around. Also interesting, it was really weird for them to think about space the way we think in Western science about space. So that was also a challenge. Even giving them a pen and a piece of paper was a bit of a challenge, and that could be discussed some other time. So what do we learn from this work? We learned that people identify 5 different vegetation types, not just the homogeneous miombo that I was expecting. So we have different places that serve different purposes. People classify the vegetation based on which species they find, but also how much fire there is in each and how much grass, which there's a relation. What's the density of the species and what elevation they can find, and very importantly, how they use these places. Local peoples, and you might have seen this in other places, don't really differentiate use and type of vegetation. These 2 things are connected, and there's not a really difference, as we've seen in many conferences that they said, well, land cover is not the same than land use. In a lot of indigenous cosmovision, it is. It is very, very connected. Most likely, also very important, you don't have to look at every map, but we were able to map the uses of the vegetation. So we were able to see, well, if we're thinking about agriculture, which places are used mostly? But if we're talking about wild food collections, which places are more important? And that was also important because we were able to give visibility to the local land users. When you only map vegetation, forest cover, you are not really making visible who's using the land. When you map agriculture, you can know where is land use and who is using the land. And it could be, you can make visible who deserve a right to the land by mapping. And this is fundamental in conservation intervention, to make visible who's using the land. Really one of the most exciting findings of our work. We were able to map and identify, I want to say, because the local land users have identified these places for generations, but science hasn't. These unique dry forests that are like, well, they're beautiful places. They're covered with mosses. They have no grass, so they're nearly, like, they're not even close to what a savanna looks like. There's some places it's very, very dense vegetation with lots of mosses, quite humid. And again, this is part of a different work, but we were able to collect some data from the whole region. We ran some floristic analysis, some the similarity matrices, some clustering, and we were able to understand that these forests, these dry forests that are called lihumbu in the local Lushase language, they're very similar, and they might be part of what has been termed the only dry forest of Africa in the continent, that we actually they have only been identified in Zambia, in West Zambia, but actually they have only been there according to the ecoregion. But actually we also have them in Angola, and they're widely distributed. And this was really thanks to local knowledge, to sitting and asking people, what do you have, and can you describe these places? How are these important? How are these different? What's the fire regime? And we were able, and I mean, we're in the process of quantifying, but the extension, it's really important, and this is really important in terms of conservation. But it's important to say, and I'm just wrapping up, it's important to say that these places might be very valuable in conservation terms because they're quite unique. These dry forests are unique in the continent, and they have really high stem density, which it's really important in terms of carbon sequestration, global climate change, but they're really important for local communities, and this is the preferred vegetation type for many of the activities of local communities. So this is important to make visible when it comes to developing conservation plans. The Angolan government are planning on developing protected areas around this place, and it's important to make visible the uses. So we learned that conventional maps can fail to account for socio-ecological complexities of the landscape. If we only focus on vegetation, we can fail to account for the importance of these places for local communities. Local ecological knowledge can assist in the process on scientific classification. We should stop seeing them as opposites, and we can see them as complementary. And it's important for management, in management process. If we continue thinking that this is a homogeneous miombo, fire, it's okay in this landscape, but fire is not okay for dry forests. Fire would be really detrimental. So it's important to think about classifying properly based on how people perceive the landscape. And it's important to integrate local perspective and to co-develop management plans with local communities rather than to do it for the local communities. Thank you. Yeah, of course, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering if you could tell us more about the kind of approach to your participatory mapping. So how many sessions did you do, about how many people participated, and right, how did you approach it in terms of describing what was happening and for what purposes you were collecting the information? Just kind of elaborate on your particular approach.
Of course, yes. So it was kind of a very organic process because at first I just wanted to understand the vegetation. And so I was like, I'm going to ask people because they know better than me. So at first I would just, my first approach on my first trip was just, I'm just going to ask people what they have. And I started hearing different local names for different things. So I was like, that was the first understanding that if they call, if I only have one forest for this place, which is a woodland, but they're giving me several names for this woodland, so why are they calling it differently? So eventually we decided with my group of supervisors and really amazing people that I'm working with to approach with participatory methods. So I undertook 3 methods. One was participatory mapping, other transect walks, another one-to-one surveys. I would sit with one person. So the participatory maps were groups of 8, no more than 8 people. I tried just because I didn't want too many people and I wanted to be able to listen to everyone, but sometimes more people joined and that was fine. I separated by age and by gender, because a lot of times there could be male dominance in the groups, and I realized that whenever they were mixed, it was mostly male dominance. So we had age and also age. Usually the elder are well respected, so they speak more. So it was, we did 34 participatory groups across 5 villages, and then we interviewed 147 one-to-one surveys, and then we did 43 transit walks. Transit walks is a really cool method, and that was amazing because when you sit with people at their house and you ask them, well, what's important around, how do you use this, where is agriculture done, they tell you lots of things, but when you're walking in the landscape and they're seeing the thing that they're talking about, they can bring so much more. So we would just walk in the landscape, then we would, whenever we found something, some vegetation cover that I was interested, we would stop there, and then I would conduct a semi-structured interview, and then I would just get the coordinates, and that's, with the coordinates, that's how I created the uses and the maps based on how people define a landscape, based on the geographic, the coordinates that they were giving me. So yeah, I don't know if that answers. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious to know, I don't know if this came up in the research, what was considered as just conservation intervention from their perspective?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something that I've challenged, and I don't think I have able to answer, because I'm often just asking myself like my position, and I'm still think I'm in a position of power. So to me, a maybe approach that it was more just than the conventional approaches was integrating local perspectives. But I'm aware that might not meet the full requirement of being just. But to me, it was a bit more than looking at a previous land cover maps. Because this place, there are plans to develop conservation areas. The maps were completely based on remote sensing satellite data that defined forest cover, forest change. So to me, to start with a more just approach was to go to the ground, to sit with them, and to ask what's around, how this is important, like how much do you use, what would happen if you cannot use this anymore, like how this would affect your life. And to me it was very important to, like, what I did is I didn't have time to present, but I also created maps of preference and value, how people value the place more or less. And to me that was going to be important to also understand how conservation intervention were going to have an impact on local livelihoods. So there are some places that are more valued by local communities, and that doesn't mean that then the other places shouldn't be paid attention to, but that was, to me, part of making visible that they have a say on what's going to happen. But it's a good question, and I don't know if I have an answer for it yet.
Okay, thank you, Luisa. Yeah, and if you have more questions, find her afterwards. Yeah. Okay. And I realized I forgot to sort of lay out the structure for today, so I should have done that. So thanks to Louisa for starting us off with the narrative. We're going to have Dan Brown now, and I'll introduce him. But before that, after we're done with the two talks, we want to foster a conversation. We've got 3 groups on either side. I'll explain that afterwards. So just to give you a heads up, after this next speaker, we're going to break up into groups and have conversations that I think these 2 talks are good examples to sort of begin that conversation. So now we have Dan Brown, who's a professor at University of Washington. I will let him introduce himself.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ash and Siyu, for organizing this session. I'm hopeful that the example that I'm providing, I know that it contrasts quite a bit in a couple of ways, important ways with the previous talk. It's an example from a first world setting in my home state in the state of Washington, and further takes a different scale of analysis to take on this question of how do we think about justice and just transitions in implementing, in this case, natural climate solutions, so another kind of intervention in the socio-ecological system to achieve some environmental outcome, in this case focused on carbon storage on the landscape. And my collaborators are postdoc Pranab Roy Chaudhry and 3 scientists at the Nature Conservancy who have been doing work across the western United States to inventory opportunities for natural climate solutions. I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of the landscape we're dealing with. This beautiful place with forests and wetlands and water bodies, but also big cities. And so we'll look at what those opportunities for natural climate solutions look like in that landscape. So just a little bit of stage setting, natural climate solutions. The notion is that we are intervening in the system in order to achieve a greater amount of carbon storage and carbon sequestration on the landscape. The overall goal is that if we want to achieve net zero emissions globally, we need systemic transformations across all kinds of sectors, the land sector being one of them, so that we can reduce emissions and maybe even get to the point where we're increasing sequestration in landscapes. And the productive forests of the Pacific Northwest is one of these places that presents that opportunity. And essentially it involves management and restoration of ecosystems with the goal of increasing carbon storage. The framing that the Nature Conservancy is using is very much that it's not just about carbon storage, that there are, the search is on for those natural climate solutions that also provide co-benefits with respect to improving habitats and biodiversity, as well as community level adaptation to climate change. And so I'm going to base the sort of first step of this analysis is an assessment that was done prior to our study of potential opportunities for climate solutions. But I came into this study looking at their potential maps for natural climate solutions and noticed that it's a biophysical assessment of where you could possibly store more carbon in ecosystems without any recognition that these are socio-environmental systems. There are people in these landscapes and dependent on interaction with the environments in which the goal is to get more carbon storage. And so any implementation of natural climate solutions will affect communities. Going back to that previous point, the Nature Conservancy is very attentive to getting those co-benefits, but the analysis that they had done didn't really include any assessment of impact on communities. And so what we're doing here is we're adding a layer into the planning process, into the screening process at the regional level to bring information about community level impacts of natural climate solutions. So building on existing assessments and incorporating the socioeconomic implications. And we do this by borrowing from the IPCC vulnerability framework. which I will get to basically provide a community-level vulnerability assessment of natural climate solution implementation in Washington State. And so the sort of initial baseline is an assessment of NCS potential. How much additional carbon storage could you get with management and or restoration of ecosystems? And so globally, there's assessments at the global, national, US, and Washington sort of going down the scales here, showing that there are potentials at the global level, large potentials, 37% of global reduction to keep warming below 2 degrees C, 20% reduction at the US level of net emissions, and in Washington State has set some targets and has legislation in place to try to meet those targets, that natural climate solutions could meet 4 to 9% of those. And this assessment by the Nature Conservancy identified multiple pathways, and they summarized those in 3 key pathways: extending timber rotations, modifying agricultural practices, and avoiding forest land conversion. And I'm going to look at those 3 and ask the question, what are the implications for communities if we were to implement those? And so we assess vulnerability using this framework from the IPCC, using exposure, sensitivity, and adaptation as the sort of screening framework. Exposure basically says, if we were to aggressively implement natural climate solutions, how much change would there be? What's the sort of magnitude of change in that community? And then we want to look at where those exposures are relative to sensitivities. And sensitivities for those 3 pathways, essentially we're working at the county level, so we use data on the forest land uses and reliance on forest sector wages within those communities to assess the sensitivity, if we're talking about the forest sector implementation of NCS, to look at sensitivity. And we do the same for agricultural land uses and urbanization pressures, which are essentially the primary pathway for forest land conversion, is urbanization in this landscape. So sensitivity is essentially which communities are going to be most affected by full implementation of NCS. And then we say, okay, well, which communities could adapt, have the sort of inherent capacity to adapt? And there's social vulnerability index was constructed and is sort of updated. I don't think it's annually, but it might be based on census data to look at the sort of economic and social marginality of communities and the resources that are available within those communities to adapt should changes occur within their local livelihood systems. And so we implement this analysis at the level of Washington State for 39 counties. We do this at the county level because there's data available for all of these dimensions, but also there are policy implementations that can be made and are being made at the county level. So there are decisions being made at the county level to pursue natural climate solutions. So understanding those communities at that scale is useful. We recognize too that there is a variation within the counties and sort of more detailed level of analysis and the kind of work that we saw in the previous talk could help with that kind of engagement at the community level. So basically what we're doing is we're mapping, this is a 2-dimensional map of all the counties with, and this is focused on the first pathway for natural climate solution implementation, which is extended forest rotations. And so we use greenhouse gas reduction potential as shades of blue, and we use on the x-axis dependence on forest wages in red. And so this is our map key down here. And so you can see those counties that have both a great degree of potential for carbon storage with NCS implementation, as well as a great degree of dependence on forest wages. It's not surprising that these things intersect with each other. And so these counties, there's a little bit of a extra label here that doesn't need to be here that's from the PowerPoint, I think, if we get rid of that. But thank you, this sort of burgundy color is those areas that have high potential and high dependence on forest wages. We have some places that have high potential and not as much dependency on forest wages. And those are sort of the communities in the suburban, exurban areas of the Puget Sound urbanized area. And so the point is that we can think about prioritizing implementation of these strategies at the county level where there might be less impact on communities, and or developing supplemental policies in those communities where there might be greater impact. And so we assess, okay, how much of it is high, where are we going to see this sort of conflict or trade-off if we were to implement NCS? And a lot of the carbon storage that we're going to get is in places where there's also high sensitivity, but there are some places where we can get less impact on communities and get carbon storage. So we did the same thing with the other two pathways, and also with adaptive capacity. And so we see that there are many of the communities in Western Washington also have low adaptive capacity. But there are some along the Oregon border, suburbs of Portland, that have a lot of adaptive capacity. They might have high forest wages, but they're relatively wealthy communities and could adapt. And so this is another dimension of the social aspects of implementation of NCS. And so we look at the other aspect of the screening tool, how much of the implementation of these NCS is going to in communities that are socially vulnerable. And we see that there's a little bit more diversity of vulnerability in those areas with a lot of carbon storage potential. So just to wrap up, as we think about implementing or using a screening tool like this in implementing NCS, we want to think about, okay, what are just transitions? So just transitions is often thought about in terms of emissions reduction within coal communities or other fossil fuel communities. And so pulling from the NDP and UNDP sort of guidelines of what do we want to think about when we think about just transitions, we can think about it in the same way in these NCS implementation communities. We want to bring the public along. This is the engagement part of this. Certainly think about supporting green jobs, shifting employment opportunities where employment is affected, laying the groundwork for the importance of the work that's going on, and reinforce and for the resilient net zero economy and reinforcing the importance of addressing climate change. I'm not going to go into this. We have a paper that outlines several of the policies within each of these pathways that could be implemented and thought about to make acceptability and durability of these natural climate solutions greater. So positive impacts of NCS that can yield co-benefits, but our argument is we want to pay attention to where those co-benefits or the social implications might need to be mitigated with additional policies. So targeting supplementary policies. And then just to the point of the workshop, scale is an important part of this. This is at one scale and recognizing that this might be part of a multi-scalar effort.
Hello? Can you? Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I had two questions kind of around the idea of just conservation. One was about land ownership, because it seemed to me that you were looking at maybe concessions or something. I'm not familiar with the context of the US, right? So who owns the lands? And the other was around like vulnerable communities here. It seemed very in terms of economic vulnerability, which I think is a very important part. But I was thinking when I read vulnerable communities, I was thinking more along the lines of racial injustices and native peoples as well. So if you could say something around that.
Totally.
Thank you.
Sorry, the first question. Land ownership. So this applies to all lands in the state of Washington, which is a mosaic of private, state, and federal, and tribal. That covers most of it, almost all of it. And so this is an assessment, as I mentioned at the beginning, the assessment of NCS potential didn't pay attention to how it was going to happen. Only what's the biophysical potential for it. And so this applies to all land ownerships. And so the point of then the vulnerability assessment is, okay, but what are the implications if we do this? And some of these counties have as much as half or more of the land is public ownership. And so some of that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have an implication for local communities that rely on that land or have businesses that rely on the extraction from those lands and so forth. And in terms of justice, absolutely. So the sensitivity measure is largely an economic measure that goes to forced wages, but it's also a land use. How much of the land is dedicated to uses related to that NCS pathway? But then the social vulnerability index is a combination. It's more like marginality across multiple dimensions. It has age, ethnicity, education, economic aspects of it, and so it brings those together, and it's a sort of a regularized measure for U.S. counties that incorporates a lot of that information.
Hi, thank you. I also really appreciate this study, so I'm trying to articulate my question not as any sort of critique, just to get your reaction to it. But it still seems right, like the importance of, and following up on this question, the importance of the kind of qualitative data and trying to understand what people in these counties would prioritize in terms of vulnerability, and thinking about, right, much more time, more resources. So this is still sort of a top-down approach where you're selecting what the vulnerabilities are, and so just kind of your reflections on that.
Yeah, I use the term screening tool deliberately in thinking about, I think about the biophysical assessment that started this whole process of, you could just go ahead and implement these NCS things on the landscape because that's where the potential is. And that's kind of what that initial effort of mapping NCS potential was about, completely ignoring people. And so what I'm saying is, well, if we're going to do that, to sort of think about which communities to engage, where to start having these conversations, we should also know something about the communities in which vulnerability, economic or otherwise, is going to be most salient as a part of the conversation. And so I think of it more as a screening tool for starting those conversations than as any kind of end point in a decision process. And also recognizing that the kinds of qualitative assessments that one would do would likely need to be at a finer resolution in the county as well.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much, Dan. And also, Luisa, for your very nice presentation that gave us very good examples at different scales and different parts of the world on all the efforts to get the social and community and dimensions into these broader level planning for conservation, for natural climate change, and for other types of developments. So now we will move into the discussion where we will invite experience from the audiences. Oh, someone worried. We will ask you to take the sticky notes from here to write down, based on your experience or project you're working on, what kind of data you are using for your project for including social dimensions and community values, what are the tools and methods you use, and what are the partners you work with. And in this sheet, we have local level, regional level, national level, and global level. You paste your sticky notes to the level you are working in. And the discussion will start from there, and I will ask the facilitators to explain the further details. Okay. Yes, and there are 3 topics that we'll break into different groups. That one is mainly about the knowledge and methods. What are best practices? What are the challenges and gaps? This one is about funding and resources. What are the resources? What are the gaps? And that one is about policy. Yes, we start with you pick your group, and let's see how the time goes. Maybe everyone just stay in their group, then we report back later. If there are more time, you can walk around the group, but I suspect you'll get to stick with your group. You can walk around and see the questions and decide. Sorry, so there are 3 topics we want to cover. One is the best practices and gaps in terms of knowledge and methods of incorporating social dimensions into plans. It doesn't have to be conservation. It can also be climate change, renewable energy, whatever. But it has to be land systems, a global land program. This one is funding and resources. That one is policy. Now you need to decide which topic you mostly tie yourself to. Sure, you can take a look first. But also take the sticky notes. Try to match the color. These purple ones are for data. Yes, 1 color of each. Okay, so we actually had more questions to reflect on, but we thought, given the time limit, I will just ask 1 or 2 people from each group to just share your thoughts after this discussion, and then we can quickly discuss what's the next step, or if anyone wants any next step.
Okay, I'll talk. So I'll just go through some of the stuff we wrote down, because we talked a lot about, like, the first thing is, like, being in the field, getting ground-based information, time, sampling intensity, like how much time do you spend when you go in, if you're doing local level work, if you're going to be in the field or trying to capture information from communities, the amount of time you spend there is really important, right? Like, it's really important to be aware of parachute science, that we don't want to contribute to that. How do we make sure that's not, right? Like, we're actively working against that and making sure our work is embedded in a community. I think Luisa mentioned something about horizontal relationships that you can talk about later if you want. But I think Adrian mentioned the use of foresight workshops. That was a method that was given as an example. I'll quickly go through other things, the importance of, like, how to find longitudinal, like, long-term social data. The different ministries that we work with was brought up, like Ministry of Environment, any other government-level organizations, like how we might be able to leverage them because they have the resources and capacity sometimes to collect this information. But the importance of doing something like a literature review before we go in to a community, right? So a lot of what Dan Brown's presentation was today was about how we might use census data or, you know, higher scale data to guide where some of these more local, finer scale approaches can be taken. I'll stop with that because I want to give time for other groups, but if anyone in that team wants to say something I missed, just put your hand up. Here.
In the funding and resources discussion, we hoped to start it with useful sources, but somehow we got right into all the objects, the obstacles. Yeah, so we heard stories about sometimes Global North Institutes, they give money to do research and they expect and require co-production of knowledge and collaboration with local partners, but they do not allow the money to be used by local partners. Or they expect you to already have a co-production plan before the funding starts, and they do not allow you time to actually do the co-production plan, or they are not flexible in terms of how the money is spent or how long things takes to actually allow you to properly engage local partners. And then there's also a burden on individual scholars, even you are from Global North, for you to go through all the practical processes and go through all these requirements to actually give money to people you should be paying for. And sometimes it's money out of your pocket upfront, and even they charge you interest after that. Then we also talked about project cycle and budgeting, and in general, sometimes it's really hard when your local partners maybe don't even have a bank account or even formal addresses. We were talking about some changes and improvements needed. For example, maybe there should be some proper incentives to incentivize Global North, Global South collaboration, which already exists, but many are led by Global North institutes. And there should be ways to incentivize Global South-led collaborations. And it may be through donor requests or journal requests or this type of things that we were talking about. Someone raised the idea of charging extra high overheads if it's a Global North PI leading project. But we can come up with more ideas and suggest to people. There are some nice ideas. Is there other things we should cover? Oh, there's also one thing about how funding and resources are distributed. We also talked about how there are regional biases, and biases are on what type of conservation is being funded. Yes.
I don't know about that. We'll see. I'll keep it short because we're a bit over. But and you've already heard from a lot of what Dan's had to say, and there was a lot of overlap with what the first group was talking about with regards to time, especially as a key constraint, and therefore funding to even do these activities, go out to have repeat meetings with local communities, hear from them and bounce ideas off each other, let them hear each other, the concerns within those communities. So yeah, time is a key constraint for not only us doing the research, but those people that are taking time out of their, largely for some of these communities it's local run and they're not paid in those positions, so they're taking up their time to do it. So you have to reflect that respect for that time. And that also goes for the Indigenous leaders that are core to the work that both Dan and I are doing. I think another key point that we were talking about was there was some overlap with your presentation yesterday with the wind energy transition and with the unseen costs of the transition in regards to the landscapes and people's ties to the rural identity that they live in. So trying to create a new vision for those rural communities is quite difficult, and therefore we need to incorporate those perspectives when we're doing modelling activities and engaging with these communities. So working out ways to either do that within the model or in the engagement process to inform policies makers down the line is something that we're still grappling with internally. Other key institutional blockers, we identified the classic lack of carbon price mechanism and compulsory to do carbon sequestration activities. A lot of the time, as we've heard, it's mostly voluntary. Yeah, I think that covers it, Dan. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you guys so much, all of you, for showing up and engaging and bringing your best selves forward. So just because we really appreciate the time and all the knowledge you've given us, we do want to let you know how we're gonna use this information. It's not just exploitative and taking your knowledge. So Siyu and I we have to actually summarize the points that we have in here because that's a big part of the session and give it back to GLP. But we are going to summarize that information, try to create, I guess, a document or some sort of, it's going to be in textual format, but we'll put together all these ideas in a way that flows, and we'd like to share it back with all of you if it's helpful in your own lives, to share with others, etc. We are going to do a second component of this workshop next week with the Nature Conservancy, where we have a bunch of scientists coming together. So we're going to put all that information together. So we're going to give it to GLP. I don't know if GLP is planning to disseminate that, but at the very least, we can. Yeah.
once we send that, there can also be a conversation from you and see if we want to do more, if we want to continue this. So it's kind of open now, but for sure we will summarize things and send it around. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, and thank you to our speakers for starting off the session and sharing your knowledge.